At his son's birthday party, surrounded by laughter and expensive wine, Thomas Blake heard it. "You're just a bricklayer, Dad." There was no venom in the voice, just dismissal, like a chalk mark on a board, wiped clean before it was ever meant to be read. It came casually during a conversation about property and scale, about glass buildings and digital investments. Jordan was leaning back in his chair, grinning in that confident way he'd learned somewhere between his third pitch deck and his first TED Talk. "You don't understand what it means to build anymore. This isn't concrete and sweat. This is leverage. This is vision." Thomas didn't flinch. He had learned long ago how to stand still while something inside him cracked. He looked down at his hands, the same ones that had carried bricks before his son ever carried a briefcase. Calloused fingers, faint white lines from long-forgotten scrapes. The hands of a man who built not only walls, but a world for someone else to climb. On the side table sat the gift he brought, a small wooden frame, hand-carved, holding a photo of Jordan as a boy. In the photo, they stood in front of the first duplex Thomas had finished as a contractor. Jordan was sitting on his shoulders, both of them smiling, covered in dust and sunlight. No one had opened the gift. No one had asked. The table was crowded with younger voices now, cousins in sleek suits, nieces talking about crypto, his own grandchildren scrolling past their dinner plates. He wasn't angry. He was tired, but not in body, in spirit. When Jordan stood to make a toast, he didn't look at his father. He thanked his team, his wife, even his early investors, but not the man who had co-signed the first loan for his warehouse. Not the man who had worked weekends to afford Jordan's business school tuition. Not the man who had, quite literally, laid the foundation under every single one of Jordan's footsteps. "From the ground up," Jordan said with pride. "We built this company from nothing." From nothing. Thomas looked around the room. No one else seemed to notice what that phrase erased. They clapped, raised their glasses, smiled, and he sat in the corner, silent. Not from shame, not from resentment, but from the deep knowing that sometimes the loudest truth is the one no one wants to hear. He thought of the first house he ever built, the way the bricks felt cold in the morning, and how they warmed by noon under the sun, how every wall he raised was a promise, shelter, stability, dignity. Now he sat in a room full of warmth and felt colder than ever. He didn't say a word that night, but something in him had shifted, not out of spite, out of clarity. Friends, let me pause for a moment. Could you tell me in the comments, where are you listening from? Have you ever experienced something like this in your own life? If this story speaks to you, please consider liking this video, subscribing, and sharing it with someone who needs to hear it. That's how you help us grow and keep telling stories that matter. Now let's continue. "You're just a bricklayer." That sentence didn't vanish after it was said. It lingered, like dust in the air after demolition. It didn't raise voices. It didn't start a fight. But it drew a line. From that day, things were different. Not in the way that people slam doors or shout across rooms. No, this was quieter, more permanent. A silence that settled between father and son like dried mortar. Invisible at first, then impossible to remove. They still spoke, but only about things that didn't matter. "How's the weather?" "Did you catch the game?" Safe, bland words. The kind strangers use when they don't want to be rude. The kind families should never need. At meetings, the son began introducing others as mentors and inspirations. People he'd met 2 years ago. The man who raised him, built his first treehouse with his bare hands. He didn't even get a nod. "Dad, the industry's changed," he said once, scrolling through blueprints on his tablet. "We're into smart foundations now, precast, laser-leveled, not just bricks and gut feeling." The father didn't argue. He just stood there, quiet, like scaffolding, useful once, but now in the way. When the son brought clients home, he never asked his father to stay in the room. But he didn't have to. The look was enough. "You wouldn't understand this part. It's beyond you." And so the father would step away, pretend to make coffee, pretend he wasn't fading in their eyes. He noticed it with the workers, too. Younger men with soft hands talking about efficiency, never once asking why the base of the east wall settled slower than the west. The father once pointed it out. One of them smiled and said, "Yeah, but the software already accounts for that now." The kind of smile you give an old dog doing an old trick. Even the tools had changed. Everything was digital now, or screens and apps. The father still carried a worn leather pouch with his tape, level, and chalk, not because he was stubborn, but because they never failed him. In the evenings, he'd go out to the workshop, not to fix anything, just to sit, to run his hand along the timber bench where he taught his son how to mix the perfect batch of mortar, how the consistency should feel between your fingers, how bricks aren't just stacked, they're aligned with the patience of a man who knows storms will come. He thought of that now often, because a storm had come, not of rain and wind, but of pride and distance. And when he looked at his son, the boy he raised on scaffolds and dusty boots, all he saw now was a man building higher and looking down. He walked onto the site slowly, his boots pressing into familiar dust, the kind that always clung to his skin for hours after a long day's work. But this time, the dust didn't feel like home. It felt foreign, like he was walking on ground that no longer remembered him. The building rising from the ground was sleek, modern, concrete, steel, glass. A marvel of design, they said. Visionary, the magazines wrote. But to him it was more than a structure. It was personal, because the very land it stood on had once been empty, until he stood there with his son years ago, knees deep in dirt, pouring the first concrete with his own calloused hands. It had started with nothing but an idea and a wheelbarrow. Back then, they couldn't afford fancy engineers. They didn't have sponsors or investors. It was just the two of them, sunrise to sundown, laying bricks, measuring, sweating. He remembered packing sandwiches for lunch and the way his son used to laugh when the wind blew their plans off the work table. He remembered teaching him how to find true level without relying on a digital screen. Now, none of that existed, not even in memory, it seemed. He stood to the side, watching as younger men, all in matching branded shirts, barked instructions into radios. They moved fast, confident, efficient, but none of them noticed the slight shift in the foundation line on the east end. No one questioned the sound of the rebar tension. They were too proud of the drones and tablets in their hands. He stepped closer, quietly. One of the foremen looked up, annoyed by the shadow. "You lost, sir? I just wanted to see the place," he said gently. "I helped to build this long ago." The man laughed. "You one of the laborers back in the day? No offense, but the real design work started recently. We tore out a lot of the old stuff. Too outdated." Outdated. He nodded, though his throat burned. Another worker joined in. "You from the crew that carried cement bags? Man, respect. That was before we had mixers on site. Primitive days, huh?" They chuckled, not cruelly, not even maliciously, but as if speaking about a past too far behind to matter, as if what had come before had been swept away and replaced, as if sweat and dust and calloused palms no longer held value unless they came with a logo and a LinkedIn profile. He looked up at the glass tower. It glinted against the sun, proud, bold, ambitious, but he could still feel the roots beneath it, the soil he had dug with his own hands, the gravel he'd chosen. The day the first slab had dried, and he had let his son carve the date in the corner with a nail. That corner was now gone, covered, buried under polished concrete, and just like that, his name, his story, his role, had been paved over, smoothed out, forgotten. He didn't argue, didn't correct them, didn't say, "This place wouldn't exist without me." He simply turned and walked away, not as a man defeated, but as a man who had learned long ago. Some foundations hold buildings. Others hold truths no plaque can name. The wall between them was growing, not made of brick, but made of silence, forgetting, and something colder than either of those. And like all walls he'd ever worked with, he knew, if no one stops it, it eventually becomes a barrier that no one crosses again. The evening was quiet, save for the slow hum of the ceiling fan above his head and the creak of the old drawer as he pulled it open. It was the kind of drawer most families had, tucked away, forgotten, filled with papers that once meant something. He hadn't looked in it for years, maybe decades. But tonight felt different. He reached in, brushing past worn-out tape measures, a couple of rusted screws, even a folded-up newspaper clipping from the week his son's company had made headlines. Next Generation Builders, it said, a young visionary reshaping the skyline. He remembered holding that article when it first came out. He'd smiled, even clipped it. Not for himself, but because he'd thought his son might like to keep it one day. That pride hadn't faded even now, though it had shifted into something quieter, something lonelier. Beneath the articles and faded receipts, his fingers touched familiar corners, thick manila folders, their edges bent and yellowed. He drew them out gently, as if handling memories, not documents. Inside were the old plans, his plans, blueprints sketched by hand, pencil lines, precise and patient, guided by years of experience. Notes written in the margins, load calculations, soil test confirmations, and then the deed. His name, clear and steady in ink, across the title to the very land on which the company's flagship building now stood. Next came the foundation certificate, signed by the city inspector, stamped, approved, and there right beneath the signature his name again, both as the landowner and as the original designer of the foundational layout. The layout still used today, only layered upon with glass and modern marketing. He stared at it for a long time, not with anger, but with that same patient silence he'd carried his whole life on scaffolding, under beams, behind the scenes. None of these documents had ever been shown, not out of shame, simply because he had never needed recognition to validate the work. His validation had been the building itself. The mornings when he woke up sore but fulfilled, the quiet knowledge that his work would outlast him. But now something ached deeper, not because they'd forgotten the paper, but because they'd forgotten the man behind it. They spoke about innovation while standing on his calculations. They celebrated new beginnings in a space born of his old hands. The certificate trembled slightly in his grip, not from anger, from age. Time had taken its toll, but not enough to erase the truth. And yet he hadn't shown anyone, not his son, not the partners, not even his grandson, who now idolized influencers in suits more than men in boots. He placed the paper down gently. The ink hadn't faded, the stamp still pressed firm. It was all still valid, legally, structurally, and morally. But the most painful part? No one had ever thought to ask. And sometimes the deepest betrayal isn't rejection, it's the silence of never being remembered at all. The sun was beginning to dip behind the steel and glass silhouette of the new building. A sleek tower that glistened in the evening light, like something out of a future he no longer recognized. There were rows of white chairs, a red ribbon across the front doors, a podium adorned with the company's logo. It was opening day, the culmination of years of work, investment, ambition, and he stood at the edge of the crowd, unnoticed. The guests had gathered, wine glasses in hand, laughter rising in polite waves. Young men in fitted suits and women with practiced smiles exchanged handshakes and praise. There was talk of metrics and growth and next phases. Music played softly in the background, some modern instrumental track, without warmth, without memory. He stood behind one of the flower arrangements near the rear columns. He had arrived early. He always did. He'd watched them hang banners and lay carpet. He saw the contractors walk past, younger than him, faster, but their movements familiar. Some things didn't change, but no one looked at him twice. Then the moment came. His son stepped up to the podium, confident, stylish, the voice of the new era. He smiled broadly, tapping the microphone. The cameras clicked. Phones recorded, and the room leaned in. "I want to thank everyone who made this possible," his son began. "My incredible team who worked day and night to bring this vision to life. Our investors who believed in the dream even when the road was uncertain. And above all, my belief in pushing forward, even when others told me it couldn't be done." Applause, glasses raised, a cheer from somewhere near the front, and then silence. He waited for it, just a line, a small nod, maybe something like, "And to the man who taught me how to build." But nothing came, not even a glance. His name never spoken. Instead, the speech ended with a phrase rehearsed and polished. "Let this be a monument to possibility, to every brick laid by vision, He almost smiled at that line. Every brick. He looked down at his own hands. Scarred. Strong. They had held those bricks once. Balanced them. Mortared them with care. Not because someone was watching, but because it mattered. Not just this building. Dozens before it. Projects when there were no cameras, no clinking glasses, no red ribbons. He had built in the rain, in silence, without funding, without applause. He remembered a winter when his son was still young, when he worked double shifts just to pay for better shoes, so the boy wouldn't freeze walking to school. He never told anyone. He just did it. The same way he poured the foundation for this very lot. Quietly. Because family needed something to stand on. And now the structure stood tall. But not one word, not one acknowledgement. He didn't need a spotlight, but a name. His name would have meant something. To be invisible in a crowd is one thing, but to be invisible to your own blood, that was different. The toast finished. Laughter resumed. The celebration moved on. And he? He turned quietly, hands still in his pockets, and walked back toward the edge of the lot. The same ground he had once measured, leveled, poured. Each step away felt heavier than the last. He didn't leave because he was bitter. He left because the foundation may have been his. But the building no longer had space for memory. He stayed behind after the ribbon had been cut, after the applause had faded into music, and the crowd drifted inside to sip wine and admire polished glass. The edges of the construction site still bore the dust of real work, the kind that sticks under your nails and never fully washes out. That's where he stood, half lit by the amber of the evening sun, watching shadows stretch across the foundation he once poured with his own hands. Someone from the past saw him. A voice, older, rough, familiar, called out from near the service door. "Mr. Hale?" It was Hector, the old foreman. Older now, slower in the knees, but the same steel in his posture. They hadn't seen each other in years, but Hector didn't hesitate. He walked straight over, took off his hard hat, and offered his hand not like an employee, but like a man greeting the one who'd once built the frame of his own life. "They never mentioned you," Hector said softly, eyes scanning the tower that now rose above them. "But I knew this place had your bones." He didn't answer, just nodded once, slowly, the kind of nod you give when too many words would only crack what's holding you together. They stood in silence for a moment, two men of brick and sweat, standing before a monument that forgot their names. Hector looked toward the entrance. "You want to go in?" He almost said no, but something deeper, quieter, made him nod. So they walked together, down the side ramp, past stacks of unused lumber and crates marked with barcodes. When they reached the side entrance, a young security guard stepped forward, eyes narrowing. "Excuse me, sir," the guard said, stepping in front of him. "This is a private event. Are you on the list?" He opened his mouth to explain and then closed it again. He wasn't angry, just tired. The kind of tired that comes not from years, but from being unseen in the place you helped create. Before he could answer, Hector cut in. "He doesn't need a list. This place stands because of him." The guard looked confused, hesitant, clearly didn't recognize either name or face. He stepped back, polite but unmoved. "Still need to check with the front." He looked past the guard, inside, where laughter echoed and suits gleamed under designer lights, and then finally he shook his head. "No need," he said quietly. He turned back, slowly, walking again toward the fading light of the parking lot. Hector didn't follow this time, just watched. It wasn't anger in his stride, it wasn't bitterness either. It was something heavier. The quiet weight of a man who knows he's not remembered, not because he failed, but because he succeeded so quietly. No one thought to ask who laid the first brick. He didn't need applause, but respect, that would have been enough. The article appeared quietly, tucked between industry updates and event recaps in a construction blog few in his family would ever read, but it found him. It was titled The Foundation Man, a project that began with one shovel and a vision. It started with a story few remembered, a story that didn't begin with capital or investors, but with a man who walked miles each morning to haul sand and stone to a vacant lot he believed in. The writer described how plans were drawn on paper that curled in the wind, how measurements were made by eye and feel, and how the man with the worn boots and permanent tan line on his wrist never once asked for recognition, only that the building stands strong. The author was Marcus Ellison, one of the original junior architects on the project, now a partner in a prestigious firm. In the article, he mentioned him by name, Samuel Hale. He called him the silent cornerstone, said it wasn't just the bricklaying, it was the vision, the guts, the quiet hours, the belief when no one else saw value in the cracked earth beneath their feet. It caught fire. Not viral, not loud, but in the corners of the industry that still respected grit, the article traveled. Contractors emailed it. Old engineers left comments that started with, "I remember him." Even younger apprentices who had only ever seen the finished product passed it around like a secret history. And then came a message, simple, sincere. "Would love to see you again. I owe you more than words. Marcus." They met at a small diner near the old train yard. Not some press-ready reunion with cameras, just two men sitting across from each other, separated by years and choices, but bound by the memory of building something with their bare hands. Marcus looked different now, tailored, polished. But when he saw Samuel, he stood, and the hug he gave wasn't for show. It lingered. They spoke for hours, about concrete and life, about blueprints and sons who saw only the surface. At one point, Marcus leaned in and said, "When I showed up on that first day, I thought I knew everything. Fancy degree, new laptop, all of it. But then I saw you, with your hands in the earth, sketching ideas in the dirt with a stick. That stuck with me. You weren't just laying bricks, Sam. You were building purpose." Samuel didn't answer for a while. His throat clenched unexpectedly. He looked down at the coffee cup, traced a thumb over the rim. Marcus continued, quieter now. "They made me partner last year. We're launching a mentorship initiative for kids from trade schools, from working backgrounds. I want to name it after you." Sam raised his eyes slowly. "That's not necessary." "No," Marcus said, his voice unwavering. "It's overdue." Samuel didn't smile. Not because he wasn't moved, but because he felt something deeper. A shift. Like a wound that had been carried so long it became part of him, had suddenly been acknowledged. He left that diner not taller, not louder, but a little less burdened. He'd been a ghost in the rooms he helped build. But now, for the first time in years, someone opened the door and said, "I see you." And sometimes, that's more powerful than applause. It happened at a sleek rooftop event. Champagne in tall glasses, conversations that hovered between forecasts and prestige. The building below them was finally complete, a monument to new vision, as the banners claimed. The sun, polished in a tailored suit, moved through the crowd like a man who owned the sky. And then came the question. One of the lead investors, a serious man named Harris Caldwell, stood near the glass barrier, gazing down at the structure below. He tapped the rim of his glass thoughtfully, then turned to the sun. "Impressive elevation," Harris said without smiling. "But the load-bearing sequence, it's unusual. Who designed the foundation?" The sun hesitated, just for a second. But in a room full of people trained to hear hesitation in numbers, in terms, in confidence, it was enough. "Our internal team," he replied. He said it too fast, then repeated slower. "Our architectural department handled it. We had experts review every phase." But Harris was already pulling out his phone. He tapped a few times. "Interesting," he murmured, "because I just got an email." Attached was a photo of an old worn certificate, issued 23 years ago, issued to a Samuel Hale. It wasn't sleek, it wasn't recent, but it was detailed, signed, and government validated. Below the scan was a short message from Marcus Ellison. "This is the original design. Samuel Hale was the author. I thought you should know." Harris didn't say anything further that evening. He simply nodded once, said, "I'll be in touch," and walked away, leaving the sun standing in the middle of a celebration that suddenly felt more like exposure. That night, the sun sat alone in his office. His name was etched on plaques, on the glass door, on the website, But now, in the glow of the screen, another name burned in front of him: Samuel Hale, owner of the land, designer of the first foundation. Bricklayer, yes, but also the man whose calculations years ago made this all possible. He leaned back in his chair and finally let the weight sink in. He had built on someone else's strength, and he had done it while pretending it never existed. In another corner of the city, the father was asleep, peaceful, oblivious to the ripple now forming, not because he didn't care, but because he never needed credit to feel fulfilled. But credit, real credit, was now finding its way to him, not by demand, not by confrontation, but because the truth has a way of settling like dust, slowly, silently, and undeniably. And some truths, especially the ones buried beneath concrete, always rise. Late that night, he sat at his kitchen table, the only light coming from the refrigerator's gentle glow. He didn't type a word, wouldn't allow himself the anger or the triumph. Instead, he uploaded a single image to the family group chat, a scanned copy of the dusty certificate. The header read in crisp type, "Foundation Design and Ownership Certified to Henry Blake." He set his phone down and stared into the dark, listening to the hum of the city beyond his window. Silence. In the chat, the little delivered checkmarks sat untouched for minutes that felt like hours. He poured black coffee, sipped it slowly, knowing the coffee would be bitter, but nothing as bitter as these unspoken years. Finally, a message came from his nephew. "Who's Henry Blake?" Next, a string of ellipses. Then from his daughter. "He's our grandfather." Her words hung in the digital air, simple and factual, but carrying a weight that echoed through every unread notification. Another nephew chimed in. "So, you designed the whole base?" No one called him Dad or Grandpa in that moment. They called him by the name they'd almost forgotten. Even he had let it slip into memory's shadow. His phone vibrated. "I always thought Grandpa just worked the site." Someone else wrote, "I feel awful." There were confessions then, small, stuttering apologies, questions about why they never knew, how they never asked. He watched the words scroll by without responding. He didn't need to. The certificate spoke for him now. Clear, unmistakable. Under the last message, "I love you, Grandpa." He simply sat in the quiet kitchen, listening to the soft buzz of reconciliation beginning. His silence wasn't cold. It was space. Space for them to fill with truth, at last. And as the soft glow of his phone lit his weathered face, he realized that sometimes the most powerful words come not from speaking, but from finally being seen. It was late when he arrived. No press, no driver, no entourage, just him. His coat slightly wrinkled from a long day, his tie loosened like it was trying to breathe after holding back too long. He stood at the gate for a few seconds before pushing it open, the metal hinges creaking like an old memory. The porch light flickered softly, the same one he used to jump toward as a child, pretending it was a spaceship beacon calling him home. Now it just reminded him how long it had been since he stepped onto these stairs, not out of obligation, but out of something closer to need. He didn't knock. The door was already unlocked, just like it had always been. Inside, the house was warm, not from the heater, but from the smell of old wood, coffee that had long gone cold, and something harder to name. Time, maybe, or forgiveness, quietly waiting. The living room hadn't changed. Same chair by the window, same bookshelf filled with manuals, blueprints, and old sketch pads. The TV was small, the couch older than some of the buildings his company now owned, but it was the wall above the workbench that caught his breath. There, slightly tilted, hung the original blueprint, the one he used to trace with his tiny fingers, pretending to understand the lines that made grown men nod in admiration. The same blueprint his father once called our future. The ink was faded, but the vision wasn't. Beneath it, etched on a worn wooden plaque, were words he had never really read, or maybe never understood. "You never build alone." He stood still. His hands trembled slightly, not from cold, but from everything that had refused to surface until now. Pride, regret, The ache of having taken something and calling it yours when it had been given, quietly, from hands that never asked for applause. In that moment, he didn't feel powerful. He didn't feel rich. He felt like a boy again, standing in the presence of something much larger than himself. Not steel or stone, but legacy. He reached out and touched the blueprint, fingers resting on the corner where the signature read, Henry Blake. There was no sound in the room, but something deep within him whispered what he had never said out loud. I didn't build this alone. And though his father wasn't there to hear it, the walls did. The wood, the lines, the foundation, all of it remembered, because some truths are not shouted. They are simply, finally recognized. He sat across from the man who had built not just the foundation of a building, but the spine of a family. And for the first time in years, he didn't feel taller. He didn't feel smarter. He didn't feel anything but small. Small in the way only truth can make you feel. Not to humiliate, but to humble. His father's hands rested on the table. Thick, calloused, steady. The kind of hands that had held bricks in summer heat, scribbled dreams into margins, repaired shoes and broken confidence. Hands that had once lifted him from a fall without a word, and later waved goodbye without guilt when he said he needed to make it on his own. He cleared his throat, but the words didn't follow easily. They stayed lodged somewhere between ego and sorrow. He looked down, ashamed of how long it had taken to see something that had always been in front of him. I was wrong, he said at last, voice barely louder than the clock ticking on the wall. I was blind to where I came from. He waited, expecting silence, maybe even coldness, but the room held only patience. I used to think if someone's hands were dirty, they couldn't have done anything great. I thought dust was failure, sweat was desperation, and you always came home with both. I never looked further. I never asked what those hands had built, beyond walls. His father didn't smile. He didn't rush to forgive or rescue him from his own words. He simply leaned back, slowly, the way only men who've seen years come and go with the same rhythm as seasons do. And then he said something the son would remember for the rest of his life. If I hadn't been in the dust, he said gently, you'd be standing on dirt, not steel. The son swallowed hard. It wasn't a rebuke. It wasn't anger. It was truth, heavy and holy, because that was the part he never understood. His father's greatness wasn't loud. It didn't walk into rooms demanding titles or applause. It was buried, like foundation always is, hidden so others could rise. He reached forward, hesitant, and placed his hand on top of his father's. Those calluses were still there. But this time, he saw them for what they truly were. Not signs of labor, but of legacy. And for the first time in decades, he didn't feel superior. He just felt proud. It wasn't the kind of ceremony people post about. No velvet ropes, no press, no overproduced music echoing through a rented hall. Instead, it took place inside the very building his son once proudly claimed to have built from scratch. The same building whose blueprints still bore Henry Blake's signature in the bottom right corner. Not as decoration, not as a relic, but as truth. There were no influencers, just influence. The chairs were simple. The floor smelled faintly of cement and dust, not of imported perfume or staged florals. In the crowd sat a few old colleagues, a couple of former foremen, and one or two retired engineers who once drank bitter coffee with Henry during 6 a.m. planning sessions. Some of them hadn't seen him in years, but all of them nodded when they did. They remembered. At the front stood his son, shoulders a little lower now. No arrogance in the way he carried himself, just weight, the kind that builds when time teaches you that brilliance without roots collapses under its own shine. He didn't open with a speech. There were no cue cards. He just held something in his hands. A frame. Not large, not golden, not dramatic, but polished, personal, and heavy with meaning. When he finally spoke, his voice didn't echo. It didn't need to. Some buildings don't appear on blueprints, he said. They're built in people. He turned toward his father. the man he once dismissed as just a bricklayer, and with both hands he offered the frame forward. Inside, a single plaque. Founding engineer, visionary, builder of men. For a moment, no one breathed. The silence didn't feel empty. It felt sacred. Henry stepped forward slowly, not with hesitation, but with a kind of stillness that only comes after years of being overlooked. His palms touched the wood of the frame. He looked at the words, then at his son. There were no dramatic tears, no loud forgiveness, just a pause and a look. And in that look, everything that was never said. Henry nodded once, a small, firm nod, the kind a craftsman makes when a wall is level, or when a door finally fits into its frame. Applause came, not explosive, but warm, not for the son, not even for the project, for the man in work boots who built something taller than towers. And in the back, leaning against the wall, a young intern who had never met Henry before whispered to his colleague, "I thought he was just some maintenance guy." The other shook his head. "Number that man built the floor we're standing on." Henry didn't hear it, but maybe he didn't need to. Because in that quiet ceremony, without headlines, without hashtags, something shifted. Not just recognition, but restoration. And it was built the same way his walls were, brick by brick, word by word, truth by truth. The space was nothing more than an old garage. Cinder block walls, a concrete floor cracked from years of weather, and a single flickering light bulb hanging from a wire. But to Henry Blake, it was perfect. Not because it was grand, but because it reminded him of where things really begin. In places no one photographs, in rooms that don't echo with applause, but with purpose. He didn't want to build another monument. He wanted to build people. Together with his son, who had now become a quiet but determined partner, they started a small foundation. Its mission was simple: teach practical trade skills to teenagers from neighborhoods most people drove around instead of through. They called it the Groundwork Project. At first, only 5 students showed up. Most of them were skeptical. Some thought it was a punishment. Others thought it was just another failed program that promised much but meant little. One boy came because it was either this or probation. Another came because he heard there'd be food. But what they found wasn't a lecture. It was a man in worn boots, sleeves rolled up, standing beside a stack of bricks and saying, "This isn't about building walls. This is about building names you won't have to shout to be remembered." They didn't answer, but they stayed. By the second week, their hands were calloused. By the third, they started asking questions. By the fourth, they no longer laughed when Henry handed them blueprints, because now they could read them. And every Friday, before they left, Henry would stand by the door and place his hand on the shoulder of each student. "Proud of you," he'd say. "You showed up. That's the start of everything." It was never about making them masons. It was about reminding them they could be architects, not just of buildings, but of their lives. One afternoon, after a long session teaching foundation leveling, a student named Marcus lingered behind. He was the same boy who once said, "What's the point? People like me don't build." He now stood, dust on his arms, pride in his voice. "Mr. Blake," he asked, "you think people like me can own something one day, not just build it?" Henry didn't answer with a speech. He handed him the same worn blueprint folder he once used with his son. Yellowed paper, careful lines, his signature in the corner. "I built this," he said, "and I give it to you. Not to copy, but to start your own." Marcus didn't say a word. He just held it tight. That evening, Henry sat back in his chair, the smell of sawdust still on his hands, and closed his eyes for a long moment. He had once been dismissed as just a bricklayer. Now he was laying something no storm could wash away. Legacy, by hand. The change wasn't announced at a press conference. There was no viral video, no sponsored post, no velvet backdrop with cameras flashing. It happened in a small office, quiet, sunlit through half-closed blinds, where David Blake sat alone, holding a black pen and a legal folder. His name had always stood alone. David Blake, founder and CEO. It looked clean, sharp, powerful, exactly how the world expected success to look. But now, looking at it, the letters felt hollow, like scaffolding without weight, a title without truth. He glanced at the folder on the desk. It contained blueprints for the next big expansion, a project that would be featured in magazines, studied in business schools, envied in boardrooms. But at the bottom of the title page, a new line had been added in small, firm type. Submitted by Henry and David Blake. No ampersand, no ink, no double LC. Just two names, a bridge, rebuilt from brick and humility. David stared at it for a long time. He thought of the day he called his father just a bricklayer. He thought of the look in his father's eyes. Not hurt, not angry, just quietly disappointed. The way a craftsman might look at a cracked wall, not because it failed, but because it was preventable. And he thought of that wall in the office, the one he used to walk past every day, never really seeing, the one with a framed photo of a construction site. His childhood was hidden in that frame, not in smiles or vacations, but in the way his father stood behind every structure, present but never posing. David signed the new documents. The ink glided across the paper slowly, as if the pen itself understood. It was tracing more than a name. It was restoring a truth. When Henry received a copy in the mail a few days later, he didn't call right away. He just sat at the kitchen table, unfolded the packet, and saw his name typed neatly next to his son's. He blinked, exhaled through his nose. In that small gesture, something shifted. It wasn't about recognition. It wasn't about ownership. It was about finally being seen. That night, David showed up at his father's house. He didn't knock, just waited by the porch, like he used to as a boy after missing curfew. Henry stepped outside, coffee in hand, wearing the same old flannel and boots. David held out the final signed copy. "This time," he said, "we build together." Henry didn't smile, didn't clap him on the back. He just took the paper, looked it over, and quietly said, "Then let's make sure it stands." And for the first time in years, father and son walked side by side, not one behind the other, not one waiting to be heard, not one needing to forgive, but as equals. Brick by brick, signature by signature, the legacy was no longer being written by one. It was carried by both. The day Henry walked away from construction for good, there was no fanfare, no ribbon, no steel girder ceremony, no camera crews to capture his last swing of the trowel. He simply locked the workshop door one final time, slipped the key into his pocket, and stepped into the late morning sun. His boots carried him down the dusty path he'd known for decades, the scent of mortar still clinging to his jeans, the lines of his face softer in repose. He settled into a small cottage near the edge of town, the kind of place he once would have improved with his own hands, but now left untouched, a quiet testament to an era that moved on without him. He grew a small vegetable garden, its rows neat but humble, and each evening he sat on the porch with a cup of tea, watching the horizon shift from gold to silent violet. He read books he never had time for, listened to birds he once disturbed with his work boots, and remembered what it felt like to be simply a man, not just a craftsman. Meanwhile, his son's world kept spinning, taller buildings, bigger projects, and a media tour that now included a different kind of message. In every interview, on every stage, David Blake no longer spoke of my vision alone. He spoke of the hands that had first placed the first stone. He spoke of the man whose sweat and skill had underwritten every success. To the viewers at home, David would begin, you see glass towers and steel beams. But what you stand on, what makes those beams safe and those towers possible, was built by a man whose name you may not know. My father, Henry Blake. He told the story of the worn leather pouch, the tape measure he still carried in retirement, the blueprints yellowed by time yet still accurate to the millimeter. He spoke of the foundation certificate signed in his father's name, and how no modern app or drone could outmatch a lifetime of hands-on experience. Journalists nodded, headlines shifted, and at last articles credited the man they had once ignored. And through it all, Henry listened on the porch. He didn't react on camera. He didn't tweet or post. He simply sipped his evening tea and watched the sunset spill over fields he had never built. One afternoon, a neighbor stopped by with a small photo album. Inside were pictures of the old workshop days, Henry and a young David in overalls, their faces streaked with dust, grinning at a half-built wall. The neighbor said, "I saw your son mention you again today. That's nice, isn't it?" Henry looked at the photographs. He saw himself, younger, full of sweat and purpose. He saw the boy who had grown into the man now honoring him. He didn't say yes aloud. He simply tucked the album under his arm and went back inside. Because foundations don't boast, they don't call the press, they don't seek headlines. They just hold steady, carrying weight so others can rise. And now, when the gleaming buildings stood tall under the sun, each one echoed with a silent truth, a truth no accolade could fully capture. He wasn't just a bricklayer, he was the reason the bricks held.